When a flight attendant ejects a black family from first class, it seems like just another act of bias. But just minutes later, the truth is revealed. This family is not only wealthy, they also own the entire airline. What happens next changes everything. Sit back and relax as you watch the video. The boarding gate is bustling with activity as passengers move quickly, eagerly settling into their seats. Among them is a family of 3. James Anderson, his wife Celeste, and their 5-year-old son Liam. James is wearing a tailored navy blue suit, holding a shiny leather briefcase. His demeanor exudes quiet confidence. Celeste is calm and radiant in a flowing ivory dress, holding Liam's small hand as he skips along beside her, giggling. The family is looking forward to their trip, a much-needed break from their busy lives. As they step into the airplane's first-class cabin, the sleek interior gleams under the warm lights of the cabin. James glances at the seat numbers with a small smile. "Here we are," he says to Celeste, guiding her and Liam to their seats. Nearby passengers nod politely, and the Anderson family begins settling in. Celeste helps Liam climb into his seat and gives him a small toy airplane, which lights up his face with excitement. Meanwhile, James stows their carry-on luggage in the overhead compartment. A flight attendant named Veronica Summers watches the family from across the cabin. Veronica's sharp gaze sweeps over them, her lips pressed into a thin line. She adjusts her crisp uniform as if preparing for action and quickly approaches their seats. Her tight-lipped smile barely conceals the judgment in her eyes. "Excuse me," Veronica says, her voice carrying a hint of authority as she speaks to James. "May I see your boarding pass?" James turns to her calmly and takes the pass from his coat pocket. "Of course," he replies with a polite nod, handing it over. Celeste looks up, sensing the tension in Veronica's voice. Liam, oblivious to the exchange, plays happily with his toy. Veronica scrutinizes the pass with unnecessary suspicion, her eyebrows furrowed as she double-checks the details. "First class," she says doubtfully, her voice shaky as if those words were hard to believe. James nods again, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Yes, this is our seat," he replies evenly, his tone considered. But Celeste catches a glimpse of the discomfort flicker in Veronica's eyes. Veronica hesitates, her displeasure evident. "I'm sorry, but I need to verify a few things with the front desk. Please remain seated," she says curtly before turning away. Her footsteps quicken, her movements tense as she disappears behind the curtain. James sits back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" Celeste asks softly, her voice full of concern. James places a reassuring hand on her arm. "Probably just a routine check. Don't worry about it," he says, though there's a slight tension around his mouth that suggests otherwise. A few minutes later, Veronica returns with 2 uniformed security personnel in tow. Her expression is cold, and she stands stiffly. "I'm afraid I must ask you and your family to leave the aircraft to resolve a booking issue," she announces, her voice rigid with no room for dialogue. The cabin falls silent. A few passengers start to glance over, sensing the change in the air. Celeste grips James's hand tightly, while Liam looks around confused, not understanding what's going on. James stands up, his voice calm but firm. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding. May I know why we're being asked to leave?" Veronica repeats her words, this time with a more commanding tone. "There's an issue with the booking. Please exit the plane." James remains calm, his gaze moving from one person in the group surrounding them. He speaks loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I don't see an issue with our ticket. We've made a reservation. We have the right to sit here." Veronica turns away to avoid his gaze, but one of the security officers steps forward. "Sir, we're just following orders. Please don't make this more difficult." James looks at his son and then at Celeste, helplessness evident in his eyes. After a moment of tense silence, he sighs. "All right, we'll get off," he says, trying to maintain dignity for his family while his heart weighs heavily. Passengers whisper, some looking confused, others avoiding eye contact. The Anderson family quietly gathers their belongings and leaves first class under the curious gaze and whispered comments of other passengers. Liam, still unaware of what's happening, tugs at his father's hand. "What did we do wrong, Dad?" James swallows hard, unable to answer his son. Celeste tightens her grip on her husband's hand, tears welling in her eyes. As they exit the plane, James's heart is heavy not just with confusion but with a deeper, more familiar wound, the wound of discrimination. James sat silently, his expression unreadable, but his hand clenched around his phone as if holding back an undercurrent of emotion that was about to explode. Celeste gently placed her hand on her husband's thigh, offering a silent reassurance, while young Liam still didn't understand what was happening, looking around confused, as if waiting for something to happen that would explain the discomfort his parents were hiding. James glanced at the clock, then lowered his head slightly, hiding half of his face, and dialed a familiar number. The call lasted less than a minute. His voice was low but firm, without hesitation or confusion. "It's me. We need to talk right now. This is serious. I want the executive team to respond within 5 minutes. No mention of personal feelings. Just an order. Just precision." When James ended the call, Celeste turned to look at him. Her gaze held no reproach, only a familiar sadness. She knew her husband had never liked using his power to assert himself. But this time, the offense had crossed the line, and she knew, once James spoke, the people on the other end of the line would have to respond with action. In the emergency operations room at the airline's headquarters, the call signal was prioritized on the screen. The lead coordinator immediately identified the caller, James Anderson. A short message appeared from the automated system. "Executive shareholder, priority 1. Silence filled the operations room for a few seconds before all senior staff began moving. A senior executive immediately stood up and ordered all non-urgent activities to stop. The ongoing strategic meeting was paused. A quick internal meeting was called to handle the emergency. "Do we have confirmation?" The coordinator's voice rang out. "Yes, Mr. James Anderson, executive shareholder, also the primary owner with controlling interest." A staff member checked the internal records and confirmed. "What's going on with the flight?" a board member asked. "He was asked to leave first class by the flight attendant. Her name is Veronica Summers. No valid reason. Based on the description, signs of discrimination are evident. We need to handle this immediately. This could turn into a media crisis in less than an hour if it leaks." A public relations executive spoke up. An urgent directive was immediately sent directly to the flight's captain. The message was brief, concise, but non-negotiable. "Restore the first-class seats for Mr. James Anderson's family immediately. Flight attendant Veronica Summers must personally apologize to him and his family in front of the entire cabin. The captain must confirm the completion of this task within 10 minutes. On the plane, the captain was preparing the flight procedures when he received the urgent order. He frowned as he read the contents. The seriousness of the message caused him to immediately leave the cockpit and step into the main cabin. All crew members watched his every movement. The captain approached Veronica gently and called her aside. His voice was stern but not loud. "Miss Summers, I just received a direct directive from headquarters. Mr. James Anderson is an executive shareholder and the primary owner of the airline. You asked his family to leave first class without a valid reason." Veronica froze. Her face turned pale, her hands shaking. I didn't know. I thought they were just regular passengers." "That's no longer relevant. The executive team's request is for you to personally apologize to him and his family immediately. Furthermore, I'm asking you to restore their first-class seating and ensure all procedures are followed smoothly." Veronica didn't say anything more. She simply nodded, slowly walked toward the main cabin, as if each step was a struggle with her inner turmoil. Passengers around began to notice the abnormality. The atmosphere grew tense. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what was about to happen. James was sitting, his hand still resting on his knee, his gaze directed forward as if indifferent to everything around him. But when Veronica approached, he lifted his head and looked at her. His gaze was calm, yet cold enough to make her almost unable to speak. "Mr. Anderson," Veronica stammered. "I'm sorry. I mishandled the situation. I hope you and your family will forgive me. Your first-class seats have been restored. Please follow me." Celeste took her husband's hand, squeezing it gently. Liam looked up at his mother, then at his father, still not understanding why the stern woman from earlier now appeared so tense. James said nothing. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked with his wife and son down the aisle behind Veronica. All eyes were on them. Some passengers silently nodded, as if showing silent agreement. The silence spoke louder than any words. They returned to their first-class seats. Their seats had been prepared again. The towels were fresh, the drinks replaced. James didn't need to confirm anything further. He sat down, gazing out of the window. The sky outside remained as calm as before, but inside him, a storm had truly begun. He wasn't angry about being kicked out of first class. He was angry because his son had to witness a power dynamic. The power to judge others based solely on skin color, clothing, or personal assumptions. And that to him was unforgivable. As passengers began settling in, the captain received confirmation from the crew. James and his family had returned to their original seats. The directive had been completed on time, but he knew everything was only just beginning. At headquarters, the executive team was still in an emergency meeting. The situation report had been recorded, an official apology was being drafted, and the list of next steps was already growing longer. A small mistake, an act of bias, could lead to unforeseen consequences. But for James, he didn't need empty apologies. He needed real change. And that 1-minute call, that was the signal for a chain of actions no one at the airline could have anticipated. In first class, Liam rested his head on his mother's shoulder, his eyes fluttering. James bent down to kiss his son's forehead. No one said anything more. But in the silence, there was the unspoken promise of a man that he would not let his son grow up in a world where someone could be insulted simply for not looking like a first-class passenger. The moment the first-class door opened again, Veronica's footsteps were clearly heard in the stillness of the cabin. She no longer carried the usual confidence or authority of a flight attendant. Her eyes avoided the gazes of others, and her steps were slow and heavy. In her hand, she held an updated list of passenger seats, but everyone knew she wasn't there for paperwork. James Anderson sat in the front row, with Celeste beside him, still holding Liam, who had fallen asleep on his mother's shoulder. Both parents didn't look back as Veronica approached. They didn't need to look to know what was about to happen. Everything had already been made clear. Veronica stood before their row, silent for a long while. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. The eyes of other passengers were fixed on her. Some whispered, others remained silent, waiting. The air felt as heavy as lead. "Mr. James Anderson, Mrs. Celeste Anderson," Veronica began, her voice small but loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I, on behalf of the airline, would like to apologize for the inconvenience earlier. There was a mistake in the ticket verification process. I take full responsibility for the incident." James looked up. His gaze was sharp but not hostile. He didn't respond, nor did he show anger. It was the silence that shook Veronica more than any criticism. Celeste remained silent, gently patting Liam's back as if trying to soothe not just Liam but her own stormy heart. Veronica took a deep breath and continued. "Your first-class seats have been restored. We kindly invite you to return to your original seats." No one clapped. There was no cheering or approval, just silence, thick and serious. Some passengers turned away, shaking their heads. A middle-aged man whispered to his wife, his voice filled with anger. "How shameful. People don't need power to be respected." James stood up. Celeste gently adjusted the small blanket over Liam, then followed her husband. Neither spoke to Veronica. They didn't need to, because what needed to be said, what needed to be proven, had already been shown through action. Veronica stepped aside, allowing them to pass. As James walked past her, the faint scent of his cologne passed briefly, enough for her to feel the distance, not in terms of status or wealth, but in character. The Anderson family returned to their original seats, the ones that had been unjustly taken from them. Another flight attendant quickly came over to help organize their carry-on luggage, while Veronica remained frozen near the aisle. her face flushed, not just from embarrassment, but from the realization that the gaze of everyone around her was now upon her, no longer with respect, but with disappointment. Celeste sat Liam down in his seat, covering him with a blanket. James sat beside him, looking out the window. He didn't say a word, but inside, his heart was turbulent. Not because of the offense, he had become accustomed to it throughout his life, but because of his son's look when he asked, "What did we do wrong, Dad?" That question echoed in James's mind. No child should ever have to be told that sometimes the color of their skin can make others think they don't deserve respect. Veronica turned away, walking as though carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She knew her apology wouldn't erase the harm, nor could it restore the respect that had been lost. But at least she had acknowledged her mistake in front of everyone. A female passenger stood up, walking over to the Anderson family's row. It was Grace, the colleague who had witnessed the whole event but couldn't intervene. She nodded quietly, her eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you for keeping your composure. You both are truly a model of kindness and resilience." James responded with a gentle smile. Celeste nodded her thanks, her eyes shining with the belief that the truth would eventually speak for itself. In the cabin, the atmosphere began to shift. A few passengers exchanged glances, nodding as if silently agreeing. A young person quietly opened their phone, typing a few lines to share on social media. The first line read, "Just witnessed a blatant act of discrimination turned around by the truth." The plane slowly rolled down the runway. The seatbelt sign lit up. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "We apologize for the delay. The flight will be departing in a few moments. Thank you for your patience and understanding." But the most important message didn't come from the intercom. It came from the dignified silence of James and Celeste, from the gaze of those who had witnessed, and from the change beginning to take shape within a system that seemed immovable. The airplane slowly lifted off the ground, carrying not only a family back to their rightful place, but also carrying a story of silence, not of endurance, but of a strength born from self-respect. Veronica sat silently behind the cabin, in the crew area. Her hand trembled slightly. She didn't cry, but inside her, all the pride she once had collapsed, giving way to something else: remorse. She knew tomorrow everything would change. For her, for the airline, and for those who once believed they could judge others just by the first impression. And for the Anderson family, this flight wasn't just a journey to somewhere on the map. It was a journey to restore dignity, quietly, but louder than any words. After the incident of being insulted and forced to leave first class, James did not display immediate anger, nor did he choose to react impulsively in a vengeful way. But after returning to his seat with his dignity restored, in the quiet moment, he opened his personal laptop, placed it on the small table in front of him, and began drafting an email. Without hesitation, his fingers typed firm but measured words. James Anderson, the executive shareholder and majority owner of the airline, sent a brief, clear message, yet filled with weight. In the email, he requested that the executive team conduct a comprehensive internal investigation to clarify the entire incident. Not stopping there, he also called for reforms in the airline's internal policies, including clear provisions on fair treatment, racial equality, and non-bias toward passengers. More importantly, James emphasized accountability, not just an apology, but a commitment to training and accountability for all employees, from management to flight attendants, to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. He wrote in the email, "An airline doesn't just fly high by engines, it flies high by professional ethics and how it treats people." Less than an hour after the email was sent, an emergency internal meeting was called. The airline's leadership team, including HR, customer service, and legal departments, were asked to be present. The focus of the meeting: the actions of flight attendant Veronica Summers. Veronica was immediately suspended from her duties pending the investigation. She was required to attend an internal interrogation chaired by the airline's ethics board. The interrogation took place in a closed room, the bright white light overhead creating a tense and cold atmosphere. Before her sat 3 members of the internal board, an HR representative, a legal advisor, and a senior executive. Veronica sat up straight, her eyes initially filled with a hint of pride and resentment. But when footage from the first-class cabin cameras was shown, accompanied by reports from passengers on the flight, several of whom expressed their outrage at how she treated the Anderson family, her expression began to change. She silently lowered her head. No more excuses to justify herself. When asked to recount the entire incident, Veronica spoke in a trembling voice but still tried to maintain her composure. "I thought they didn't look like first-class passengers. They were dressed too casually. I was wrong." A board member asked pointedly, "Do you realize that judging someone based on their appearance is a serious act of bias, especially in a service environment?" Veronica hesitated, then nodded. "I admit, I judged him and his family solely based on their appearance. I thought they weren't the type of people who fly first class often. And I made a serious mistake." She tried to suppress her emotions, but her eyes were red. Shame and regret were evident on her face. The interrogation lasted more than an hour. The results were documented, and a report would be presented to CEO Robert Lang at the upcoming meeting. Meanwhile, Veronica was required to take a leave of absence, prohibited from interacting with passengers or any frontline roles within the airline. As for James, he did not make any public appearances, no social media posts, no interviews. He chose silence, a silence full of weight, but those who worked with him knew. This was the preparation for long-term strategic action. In the internal newsletter sent to all employees the following morning, CEO Robert Lang confirmed that the request from executive shareholder James Anderson had been taken seriously. He announced that the airline would conduct a thorough investigation into the passenger reception process, organize comprehensive retraining for all flight attendants and customer service employees, implement more transparent policies for handling complaints and professional misconduct. Robert also announced that the company would collaborate with an independent third party to reassess the company culture and any potential unconscious biases within the entire system. In an unprecedented move, the board of directors instructed each department to report on the progress of reforms within 30 days. Veronica, no longer the flight attendant once praised for her professionalism, now faced severe personal consequences. In addition to being suspended, she became the subject of internal discussions, a prime example of the fallout from prejudice. Those who had worked with her began to view her differently. Gone were the friendly greetings and camaraderie, replaced with avoidance, sympathetic glances, and sometimes silent reproach. However, Veronica did not resist. In a brief email sent to HR, she admitted her entire mistake without excuses or blame shifting. She wrote, "I reacted irrationally and unprofessionally. I let prejudice control my behavior and caused harm to people who should have been served with the utmost respect. I accept responsibility and am ready to face any form of discipline." James was informed about Veronica's statement and her admission of guilt, but he did not respond immediately. He was waiting for something bigger, real change from the system, not just the firing of an individual or a personal apology. For him, this story was no longer a private matter. It was a matter of principle, a test for the entire airline industry about how they treat people, especially those who are often judged unfairly because of their skin color or appearance. And James knew this was just the beginning. The news began with a social media post from a passenger who had been seated near the Anderson family that day. The woman, an independent writer, had witnessed the entire incident from the moment the family entered first class to when they were forced to leave without a valid reason. She posted, "A polite black family kicked out of first class just because they didn't look like first-class passengers? What era are we living in? Fairness when flying." The post quickly went viral, being shared thousands of times within hours. Soon after, short videos from other passengers started appearing, showing the brief argument between Veronica and James, the tense glances from nearby passengers, and the moment when Veronica was forced to apologize before the Anderson family was returned to first class. Social media exploded. Sensational headlines from major news outlets began to emerge. Family kicked out of first class. Turns out they own the airline. Flight attendant bias or systemic judgment. Responsibility. A story of dignity and justice in the sky. Hashtags. Hashed responsibility and hashed fairness. When flying flooded Twitter, Facebook, and even TikTok, hundreds of thousands of comments, millions of views. Many shared similar stories they had witnessed or experienced, being doubted, judged, simply because of their skin color, appearance, or background. The public's outrage wasn't just over the actions of one flight attendant. What made this wave even more intense was the feeling that a deeper truth was being exposed, an unconscious bias system, a corporate culture that had silently condoned favoritism for too long. As the media rushed to dig into every detail, the airline was faced with an unprecedented storm. The customer service hotline became overwhelmed. Promotional travel posts on the airline's official pages quickly turned into targets for criticism. One-star reviews flooded Google reviews and Yelp. Customers canceled flights, and the airline's stock price plummeted within 24 hours after the story went viral. Robert Lang, the CEO of the airline, realized this was no longer a media incident that could be dealt with by a half-hearted apology. He called an emergency meeting with the board early the next morning. In the meeting room, real-time statistical charts clearly showed the damage: a sharp drop in ticket bookings, a surge in cancellations, and a severe impact on brand image on all fronts. Robert's gaze was solemn as he looked at the screen, then slowly spoke. "We have no choice but to restructure the entire internal culture. This is the wake-up call we've ignored for too long." He began drafting a reform plan, not just an image campaign. It was a concrete roadmap that included a full review of the employee training process, a review of past similar complaints, introducing mandatory training on unconscious bias, equality in service, and personal responsibility. The media continued knocking at the door, reporters calling and sending emails in a frenzy to the company's PR department. But James Anderson was different. From the moment he made the call to the executive team after the insult, James had decided not to make any public statements, not to respond to the press, and not to appear on any news channels. The media expected a strong statement from the airline's largest shareholder, but James chose silence. James's silence wasn't because he was afraid or had nothing to say. On the contrary, it was a highly strategic decision. He knew that in moments like these, every word could be distorted, every emotion could be exploited. He didn't want to become the face of a media storm, but wanted change to come from real action, from within the system. He wanted what happened to not be just a passing wave of anger, but a push that would shift the entire structure that had existed in the shadows for too long. For Celeste, his wife, those were quiet days. She didn't go on social media, didn't read comments. Every morning, when she took Liam to school, she felt the stares of others, some sympathetic, some curious, even a few awkward. But she smiled, keeping a peaceful atmosphere for her family. Meanwhile, in the quiet offices at the airline's headquarters, the dedicated teams were working tirelessly to handle the crisis. Emails flew back and forth between the board, the legal department, communications, and the strategy team. An internal document was drafted specifying all flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff will undergo mandatory training within the next 30 days. No exceptions. Robert Lang personally drafted the public statement. This time, it wasn't just a simple apology, but a commitment to concrete action. The draft was 4 pages long, listing specific steps: comprehensive reviews, employee surveys, establishing confidential reporting channels, and involving third parties to monitor the implementation of reforms. However, before it was released, Robert decided to send a copy to James, not out of obligation, but because he knew, without James, the airline would never have been forced to face itself. James received the email that night. He read every word, his eyes betraying no emotion, but inside he understood that his decision to remain silent had already brought results. The next morning, a single post appeared on James Anderson's personal LinkedIn account, which had been inactive for months. Not anger, but sustainable change proves dignity. I'm still watching. That post received over 3 million interactions within 24 hours. No images, no emojis, just a gentle statement, but one that made the whole community reflect. Public opinion began to shift. The anger was still there, but now it came with hope. Hope that there could be a better system, that if those involved were determined and wise, mistakes would not be overlooked, and dignity would not be traded for silence or cover-ups. In a profound article in The New Yorker, a journalist wrote, "The Anderson event is not just a story about discrimination. It is a reflection of how we view each other, judge each other, and sometimes hastily dismiss each other based solely on appearances. And the way that family chose to face the harm with persistence and dignity made all the difference." And in a small cafe on the outskirts, where Veronica Summers sat quietly reading comments and articles, a tear slowly fell onto the page. She didn't know what her future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. The bias she once considered unconscious had become a lesson that tore away the illusion she had covered with the guise of professionalism. As for James, his actions continued in silence. He held private meetings with internal HR teams, driving the implementation of the change roadmap. He didn't need applause. He only needed to see one day when another family steps into first class. They would be seen with human eyes, not judged, not doubted. And that made the public wave not just about anger, but transformed into a commitment. A commitment that justice, once nurtured with awareness and perseverance, will always have the chance to prevail. The highest meeting room in the airline's headquarters was filled with a tense and solemn atmosphere. From the large glass windows, the morning sunlight streamed onto the polished walnut conference table, reflecting the faces of those present. Each person understood that today's meeting was not just about resolving an incident, but about confronting a system that needed change. And at the center of it all was James Anderson, the black man with a calm yet resolute gaze, silently flipping through the documents in his hand. This was not his first time attending an executive board meeting. As an executive shareholder and primary owner, he had been present at strategy sessions, business direction discussions, and financial planning meetings. But this time, everything was different. This time, he wasn't there to discuss profits. He was there to demand justice, not only for himself and his family, but for all the passengers who had silently endured injustice. Robert Lang, the CEO of the airline, entered last. He wore a dark gray suit, his face serious, his eyes clearly marked with tension. Robert knew the gravity of the situation. He nodded slightly as he passed James, then sat in the chair at the head of the table. "First," Robert began, his voice calm but with a trace of tension, "I want to thank all of you for being here today. As you know, the incident on Flight 117 with Mr. James Anderson's family has sparked a strong public reaction and, unfortunately, exposed significant gaps in our system." James did not react. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the CEO, as if reminding him that words meant nothing without concrete action to follow. Robert turned to James. "Mr. Anderson, I'll hand the floor to you. We want to hear directly from you, not just as a shareholder, but also as a witness to this incident." James slowly stood up. He placed his file on the table, his hands clasped together. His voice was steady, neither high nor low, but each word cut through the air like a sharp blade. "I am not here to demand personal honor. Honor is not in first-class tickets or titles of ownership. It lies in how a person is treated, with respect. And my family and I did not receive that." No one spoke. The board members lowered their heads, avoiding James's gaze. "I have 4 clear demands," he continued, short and to the point. 1. I want a transparent and detailed progress report of the internal investigation, conducted by an independent third party. 2. I demand a comprehensive review of our internal policies and culture, including recruitment, training, and incident handling processes. 3. A public apology, not just to my family, but to all customers who have been treated unjustly without the opportunity to speak out. And finally, I demand a clear, practical, and actionable organizational culture reform plan, with deadlines and commitments from the leadership. The room held its breath. These demands were not excessive, but they called for a root-level change. Robert Lang stared at James for a long moment, then nodded, slowly but decisively. "Mr. Anderson, your demands are entirely justified. On behalf of the leadership team, I accept all 4 conditions. Within 30 days, we will collaborate with an external auditing organization to conduct the review. An official report will be sent to you and all shareholders. As for the public apology," Robert continued, "we will issue a press release within 48 hours and designate a spokesperson for the upcoming aviation conference to commit to the reform. Regarding the organizational culture reform, I've instructed the HR team to draft an emergency plan, prioritizing the retraining of all frontline staff, especially the customer service department." James showed no emotion. He remained silent, but his gaze slowly scanned the room, as if sending the unspoken message. "I am listening, but I will not trust easily without concrete action." A board member raised his hand. "Could you share more details on the monitoring system for the reform progress? Is there a mechanism to ensure that the commitment will not be forgotten over time?" Robert turned to James. "In fact, I propose that Mr. Anderson directly monitor this process as an executive shareholder representative. You will have full access to reports, documents, and be involved in any specialized meetings on cultural reform." James nodded slightly. He was not seeking power. He only wanted to ensure that what had happened would never happen again, not to anyone else. "I will oversee it strictly," James said, for the first time showing firmness in his words. "Not to control, but to ensure. If any part of the plan is delayed, rushed through, or forgotten, I will use all of my authority to bring the matter before the board and the media." The room fell silent. No one dared oppose. They understood. This was no longer a personal story. It was a test of ethics, honor, and the future of an entire system. Robert stood up. "I commit, on behalf of the entire leadership team. We will not make you remind us of this again. This is not just a reform, it is a rebirth." James looked around the room. He did not clap, nor did he smile. He only nodded slightly, then gathered his documents and walked out of the meeting room. When the door closed behind him, everyone else in the room remained silent, as if they had just weathered a storm. But they knew clearly that storm was necessary. It had swept away the false assumptions, the unconscious habits, and opened a new path, a path of justice and real change. As James walked down the long white stone hallway, he didn't feel as though he had just won. He only felt relief, because his voice, this time, had been heard in the right way. Part 8. The official news was released by the airline's internal communications office on Monday morning. A brief announcement, but containing an irreversible decision. Veronica Summers was officially terminated after the completion of the 2-week internal investigation. This decision came as no surprise. It was the inevitable consequence of what had transpired. But for Veronica, when she received the email notification from HR, the shock still overwhelmed her mind. The woman who had once proudly been a flight attendant with over 10 years of experience now sat quietly alone in her small apartment. Weak light filtered through the curtains, casting a glow on her gaunt face and tired eyes. The past days had been a series of sleepless nights, endless keystrokes, and nightmares that returned to the image of the Anderson family. Young Liam's confused face as he was forced to leave first class still haunted Veronica's mind. She didn't try to justify herself. No more excuses to hide the wrongful actions she had caused. For the first time in her life, Veronica had to face herself, not as the polite flight attendant in her neatly pressed uniform, but as the woman carrying unconscious biases that had hurt others. After receiving the termination decision, Veronica began looking for courses on bias, discrimination, and personal accountability. No one asked her to do this. No mitigation was offered. But she knew that if she didn't change from within, she would never find herself again, or be worthy of any future second chances. The first few lessons brought her to tears. Listening to stories of harm, the silence of those who suffered discrimination, and the price they paid just because of their skin color or background, Veronica realized she hadn't just made a mistake. She had contributed to perpetuating an unjust system that she had once considered harmless. On a light, rainy afternoon, after many days of hesitation, Veronica wrote an email to the Anderson family. No flowery words, no excuses, just an honest letter written with all the courage left in her. Dear Mr. James Anderson and family, I write this letter not to ask for forgiveness, as I understand that there are mistakes that cannot be erased just by an apology. I write because I need to take responsibility. I hope you understand that I now realize what I did was wrong, and I am beginning the journey to change myself, not for reputation, but for the truth and conscience. I was wrong to judge others based on their appearance. I was wrong not to listen and to let my arrogance cloud my ability to distinguish right from wrong. I do not deserve the position I once held, and I fully accept the consequences I am facing. I do not expect your family to forgive me, but if there comes a day when I can do something to make amends, no matter how small, please let me know. Sincerely, Veronica Summers. James read the letter in silence. He didn't say anything to Celeste, nor did he reply immediately. He placed the phone down, looking out to the yard where young Liam was playing with a model airplane, the gift the airline sent as a goodwill gesture after the incident. The next day, James received a call from CEO Robert Lang's office. In the short but detailed call, Robert updated James on the airline's reform progress. Mr. Anderson, I report 80% of frontline staff have completed the new training on bias awareness and fair customer service. We are now in phase 2, implementing a three-way feedback model between staff, customers, management to promptly address issues. James nodded slightly, listening to the numbers. He didn't need compliments or grandstanding. He needed to see real action. And with this report, he began to see the light of change creeping into every link of the old system. A week later, the Anderson family boarded a new flight to attend a conference on racial equality in the aviation service industry, where James was invited to be the keynote speaker. As they entered the airport, no one recognized them as the executive shareholders. No red carpet, no media cameras, just a small family. The father, mother, and son, casually dressed, pulling their suitcases, standing in line like any other passenger. But this time, from the look of the check-in staff to the attitude of the flight attendants at the boarding gate, everything was different. They were not treated specially because of their power. They were treated kindly because they were human. James felt it in the sincere gaze, in the voice of the young flight attendant who bowed to them as they entered first class. Celeste turned to her husband, gently holding his hand. "Do you see it?" she whispered. "This time, it's real." James didn't say anything. He only smiled faintly, then looked down at Liam, who was excitedly sitting by the window, his eyes fixed on the sight of planes taking off on the runway. For James, honor was not something to demand back at all costs. It was something to be restored correctly, responsibly, and sustainably. And this journey, though slow, had truly begun. Just a few weeks after the incident on the flight, internal communications reports revealed a surprising trend. Other airlines began holding emergency meetings, reviewing their passenger policies, particularly in departments that directly interact with customers, such as flight attendants, ground staff, and customer service departments. On aviation industry forums, the term internal fairness culture began to appear with increasing frequency. No one viewed the Anderson family incident as an isolated issue anymore. It had become a jolt that opened the door to deeply unacknowledged truths. A domestic airline in Texas organized a special training session, inviting a speaker who was an expert in bias psychology and communication equality. Another airline in New York launched the Anonymous Passenger Listening Program, where customers could report discriminatory behavior without fear of being identified. CEOs, who had previously considered service policies a secondary factor, now spent time reading every single passenger feedback. They didn't want to be the next airline named. And amidst all this movement, the Anderson family gradually became a symbol, not for fame, but for their unwavering, quiet, yet profound commitment to defending justice and human dignity. James did not step in front of the media cameras with sensational statements. He did not attack anyone, nor did he turn the situation into a political tool. Instead, he chose silence with weight, speaking only when necessary, always focusing on the system, not the individuals involved. A non-profit organization focused on social justice invited James to become an honorary advisor. He declined television appearances but quietly contributed to the development of a human rights education program in the service industry. Celeste, the woman who always gently stood behind her husband, was now invited to speak at forums about the role of women of color in driving change. But she only smiled and said, "I'm just a mother. I do what I believe is right." International media began to take notice. A British newspaper ran a headline, "The Anderson Family, a lesson in self-respect in an era of indifference." At an aviation industry conference in Asia, the Anderson family story was selected as an exemplary case for discussions on service reform. The name Anderson suddenly became a symbol, but not the kind of flashy symbol. It became a symbol of humility paired with determination, of politeness intertwined with moral strength. However, for the Anderson family themselves, this story did not end with a personal victory. They did not consider being publicly apologized to, having their dignity restored, or other airlines following suit as the endpoint. That was merely the beginning of a longer journey, building a fairer system where every passenger, regardless of their skin color or background, is treated with the basic respect every human being deserves. On a peaceful afternoon, in the backyard of their small suburban home, soft golden sunlight stretched across the lawn. James sat in a simple wooden chair, holding a hot cup of tea, his eyes following his son, Liam, who was playing with a plastic toy airplane. The boy imagined himself as a pilot, making the toy plane soar in the air, his mouth shouting engine sounds. Celeste walked out of the kitchen, bringing a plate of freshly baked cookies. She placed her hand on her husband's shoulder, gently squeezing it. "Do you remember the day we were kicked out of first class?" she asked softly. James nodded, his eyes still fixed on their son. "At that moment, you weren't angry," Celeste continued. "You just held my hand and said, 'It's okay. We don't need a first-class seat to keep our dignity.' But now, the entire industry is changing just from a moment like that." James turned to his wife, smiling faintly. "That wasn't our power, Celeste," he whispered. "That was the power of truth, when it is looked at straight on." In the corner of the yard, Liam looked up, running over to his parents with a bright smile. He raised his toy plane high and said, "Dad, I want to be a plane designer when I grow up, so everyone can have a comfortable seat like us." James bent down and ruffled his son's hair, his gaze lingering on the child's face. In those innocent eyes, he didn't just see his son's future, he saw a shared future, one where all of us deserve fairness, whether on the ground or in the sky. The story of the Anderson family wasn't just a unique event on a single flight. It was a mirror reflecting the quiet truth that existed in many systems, where unconscious biases, judgmental glances, and assumptions about power and status still seeped into daily behavior. The Anderson family did not use their power to claim a first-class seat back. They did not respond with anger or revenge. They chose to respond with calm, unwavering resolve and an unshakable belief in justice. And that is what made them strong. They didn't seek a victory for themselves, but chose to build a victory for the whole community. A victory of dignity, of fair treatment, and of respect between human beings. Veronica, who made the mistake, also became a mirror for us to look at ourselves. Because in each of us, whether unintentionally or deliberately, there are judgments based on appearance, skin color, or background. But the truth is, every person deserves to be treated with equal respect, not because of who they are, but simply because they are human. And most profoundly, it was Liam, the innocent child playing with his toy airplane, who became a symbol for a new generation, where fairness is not a luxury, but an inherent right. The future does not lie in the hands of the powerful adults, but in the hearts and dreams of children, nurtured in love, kindness, and a society that knows how to listen. To you, the one listening to this story, You don't need to be rich or a major shareholder to make a difference. You just need to be someone who dares to stand up when you see something wrong. You just need to be someone who doesn't bow to prejudice, who doesn't stay silent in the face of injustice, and who doesn't lose compassion in a world filled with indifference. Change begins with a word, an action, an attitude of fairness, no matter how small. And then, those small things will connect into a wave strong enough to shake the old system. If this story has touched your heart, help spread it to more people by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Not for us, but for a society where everyone is seen through the heart, not through the eyes of prejudice. Have you ever been judged wrongly for your appearance, skin color, or background? How did you overcome it? Please share your story. Who knows? You might be the inspiration for someone silently enduring out there.